Tales from the Ribble Valley by Cornelius MacManus and George Hull. The Mystery of Ruth Beckett. In a roomy old house at Cowle, surrounded by a guard of clustering elms, Gabriel Grant lived the pleasant life of a gentleman farmer. Omitting servants, Mr. Grant's family consisted of only 2 persons, himself and his niece, the latter being about 18 years of age at the time of the commencement of our story. Pleasant in countenance, as well as tall and shapely, Ruth Beckett still seemed unconscious either of the comeliness of her face or the symmetry of her figure. Though by no means haughty, she was somewhat shy and reserved, and seldom sought the company of her neighbours. Her manner, when once known, charmed the few who came in contact with her. One reason for her comparative isolation was that Lonely Crags justified the name given it by standing at a distance of a couple of miles from its nearest neighbour, another farm which shall be known as Heath Edge, and which was occupied by a farmer named Henry Barton. It may be guessed that, in her comparative loneliness, Ruth's thoughts often led her into realms of dreaming land surmise. Among other things, she wondered where she had been born, for though her recollection carried her back to an ivy-clad house close by the bank of a river, she did not know the name of the place, nor where it was situate, nor why she had been taken away from it. Once or twice she made inquiry from her uncle, but the only reply she received was that it did girls harm to know too much, and that she had been carried away from home and brought out to Cowle in consequence of the loss of her father, that her mother had died in giving her birth, and that her father had 2 years afterwards followed her to the grave, were all the particulars that Ruth could glean as to her past history, and her curiosity would certainly have prompted her to seek further information, but that her uncle was invariably displeased at any reference to these matters. Darkness had set in upon a late autumn evening. The fires were made up, the blinds were drawn down. Ruth took her knitting, and her uncle carefully filled his long churchwarden pipe and settled himself comfortably in his armchair. Thus the repose of the evening had commenced, when the yard dog outside broke the silence with its bark, and a moment afterwards a knock was heard at the heavy oaken door. "Whoever can it be at this time of night?" asked Gabriel, straining his ears in a vain attempt to catch the conversation in the porch. In a minute the maidservant came to say that a gentleman wished to see Mr. Grant. From the emphasis which the girl laid on the word gentleman, it was plain that she regarded the visitor as somebody entirely out of the common, and it was with some surprise that Gabriel rose from his seat and went to confer with the stranger. Ruth shared her uncle's surprise, and her curiosity was aroused when she heard her uncle ask the stranger to come inside. Gabriel led the visitor into the best parlour, the apartment where the old oaken chests, the uncomfortable high-backed chairs, and the cold portraits of unknown and uninteresting gentlemen were displayed to the best advantage. Half an hour passed, and at the end of that time footsteps were heard in the wide lobby. The door opened, and Gabriel Grant entered, followed by a gentleman, whom he introduced to his niece as Mr. Lee, an old friend who had come to stay a few days with him. The newcomer was tall and manly. He was not in appearance much above 40, but in a man of athletic training, appearances are deceitful, and he might possibly have reached his 50th year. His hair was of a rich brown colour, with only here and there an occasional streak of grey, but he looked a soldier all over, and Ruth felt from the first an uncommon interest in her uncle's unexpected guest. Mr. Lee, too, seemed interested in Ruth, for as surely as ever she allowed her eyes to wander in the direction in which he was sitting, so surely was he looking at her. But the moment she caught sight of him, he would withdraw his eyes, only, however, to let them again rest on her the moment she turned to her work again. Mr. Lee and her uncle now and then spoke, but the conversation was of short duration, and concerned matters of which Ruth knew nothing. Consequently, her own thoughts were her chief companions until supper time. At supper, Ruth ministered to the wants of her uncle and his guest, and the latter's glances betrayed his admiration of the young lady's dexterity. Mr. Lee had excuse for this apparently intrusive appreciation of Miss Beckett's merits, for her uncle continually mentioned her domestic efficiency, praising her cooking, her economy, her method, and her general worth, in a manner that brought blushes to Ruth's cheeks. All retired to rest at an early hour, but to the maiden sleep did not come as quickly nor as easily as it was accustomed to do. Whether it was because she saw few visitors, or because the erect carriage and bold manly appearance of Mr. Lee came up to her ideal of what a man should be, it was certain his presence affected her in a different manner from that of any other of her uncle's friends. The following morning Ruth was up early, as was her wont. When her uncle came down, he explained to me that the visitor was a gentleman whom he, Mr. Grant, had known years before he came to Sawley. Mr. Lee would, he said, spend a few days with them, but was not anxious to leave the precincts of the farmhouse. Indeed, it was desirable that his presence there should be known to as few persons as possible. Ruth was busied with her household duties during the day, while her uncle and Mr. Lee walked about the orchard together. Whenever Ruth caught sight of her uncle, she saw by the expression on his face that the conversation was more like serious discussion than friendly chat. Indeed, so moody and pensive did her uncle become, that in the course of a week Ruth resolved to inquire from him the cause of this unusual depression of spirit. Ruth could not think that the stranger was the real cause of this unwelcome change in Mr. Grant's demeanour. He seemed to be such a gentleman that she would not willingly have heard a single word in his disfavour. In truth, the longer Mr. Lee stayed, the more Miss Beckett saw to admire in him, though when she boldly asked herself the reason for all this, her mind would suggest no answer to the inquiry. Pure, gentle maiden, in the sweet simplicity of her rustic nature, she had never experienced love. She was but a girl, and had but heard of love as the wondering child hears of the Indies or the Poles. That it exercised a potent influence for good or evil, she was aware, and when she felt the difference which Mr. Lee's presence in her home had already made, she asked herself if this curious and unfathomable attraction was in reality the thing they call love. The days passed as slowly and uneventfully as they always had done at Lonely Crags. Ruth's duties occupied her so much during the day that she had little time for indulgence in vagaries of the imagination. "Lass," said her uncle one morning, having come silently behind her as she was laying the cloth for breakfast. "Lass, you've seemed to be lost in your thoughts a deal lately. What's the matter with you?" "Nay, what's the matter with you? I've noticed that ever since Mr. Lee came into the house, your manner has changed, and I have been wondering whatever the matter could be." "Would you like to know?" asked her uncle, seating himself in an armchair and turning it towards her. "Yes, I would very much like to know," she answered eagerly. "Well, if I tell you, you mustn't ever breathe a word of it to anybody else. Now, lass, for 15 years I've kept the secret myself and told nobody. Won't do you any good to know, but as you were curious and I think I can depend on you, I don't mind telling you." The niece promised that she would faithfully observe the condition of silence, and drawing near to her uncle, listened as he told her in low tones the reason why he was so downcast at Mr. Lee's appearance. "Mr. Lee was one of my best friends, but he had stroke of very bad luck. Very bad luck indeed. Mr. Lee was an officer in the army, you can almost guess that by his looks, and a finer man never tasted bread. But misfortune will come to us sometimes, however good we may be. Mr. Lee lost his wife, and before he had got over the shock that her death had caused him, He had to leave the country, to leave home and friends and everything. It will be of no use to tell you why. It was for an offence he did not commit. It was because he'd been too anxious to save a young man from the consequences of a very foolish, of a very dishonourable act. It was to save a good family from disgrace that he went. It was a mad act. He should have stopped and faced the inquiry that was made. Certainly, the real culprit would then have been brought to book, but that's how it should have been. If Mr. Lee hadn't been driven out of his mind by his wife's death, he would never have gone off in the way he did. And not to think too hardly of the man who really was guilty, I believe he would have refused to be shielded at Mr. Lee's expense, but that almost straightway word came that Mr. Lee had died at Brussels, and until a very short time ago I really believed that was true. Now, continued Gabriel after a pause, he's turned up in this country like a hiding culprit, but it was too late to seek to justify himself, and Mr. Lee must abide a lifetime by his rash act, though he did it out of the purest charity. This was all Mr. Grant had to say concerning the visitor, and from his manner when he told the story, Ruth easily understood how it was that the presence of his unfortunate friend had proved so depressing to her uncle's spirits. But Gabriel cautioned his niece again and again against ever allowing Mr. Lee to suspect that she was aware of the mystery that shrouded his life, and Ruth was firm and faithful to her promise of silence. After staying at Lonely Crags for 3 weeks, Mr. Lee announced his intention of leaving. The departure was carried out upon a Tuesday night, Mr. Grant driving his visitor to Chatburn to catch a late train. The farewell between Gabriel and Mr. Lee was private and occupied all the afternoon, and the goodbye to Ruth was delayed until the last moment. The vehicle that was to carry Mr. Lee away from Lonely Crags stood at the door. Uncle Gabriel, with heavy greatcoat and thick riding hat that folded down over the ears, paced the hall, whip in hand. From time to time his eyes consulted the old case clock that ticked so regularly and monotonously in the corner opposite to the door. By and by Mr. Lee came down the passage as Miss Beckett emerged from the silent precincts of the best parlour. The stranger seized her hand and, holding it, looked into her face with an earnest, wistful gaze, and as he did so, 2 big tears coursed slowly down his cheek. "Goodbye, miss. Goodbye, Ruth," he said, and then, with an effort to hide his emotion, he quickly darted down the hall and jumped into the gig, and with another half-choked goodbye as they drove off, the stranger passed away into the darkness. "Never mind, you'll come again before long," were Gabriel's consoling words, but the other seemed to heed them not, keeping sorrowfully silent until they were far on their way towards Chatburn. And all this time Ruth sat in the small sitting-room, where the firelight and the shadows played with fantastic forms in the shady corners, and the silence was unbroken, save for the distant, dull, methodical ticking of the clock in the hall beyond. She was crouching on a low stool by the fender. She was wondering what the meaning of Mr. Lee's short but touching farewell might be, and by no fanciful contortions of possibilities could she conceive that the misfortunes of Mr. Lee, as related by her uncle, had inspired her feelings towards the visitor, or the latter's inexplicably affecting goodbye. We have mentioned Heathedge Farm as the nearest dwelling to Lonely Crags. The owner, Henry Barton, had a son named John, for whom he had done his best to provide an education superior to that usually given to young men of his class. When John returned from the agricultural technical school, where he had passed 4 years, he came determined to put his acquired theories to practice upon his father's farm. There was a party to celebrate the homecoming of the son and heir. All the neighbours, that is, everyone who lived within 6 miles, were there, and the pranks that were played by the young folks, as well as the tales that were told by the old, made the occasion one to be remembered by all who were present. Uncle Gabriel and Ruth were among the first to arrive, because anyone so popular as Uncle Gabriel was had to go through a long course of preliminary handshaking before even looking at the more essential enjoyments. Ruth was the belle of the evening, acknowledged by young and old of both sexes, though the girls attributed her superior attractions to her boarding school education, a supposed benefit which they had never been allowed to acquire. And so the old folks wagged their heads and told their tales, while the young ones essayed the bewildering motions of the mazy dance, so different, their elders said, from the staid, sensible dances of 40 years before. Without entering into particulars, we may say that several lifelong engagements dated from that night, but it behoves us to confess that Ruth returned from the party with a feeling that love was not what she had suspected, and that Mr. Lee, however much she might esteem and pity him, did not occupy her heart of hearts. Jack Burton, the bluff, well-built, hearty fellow, persistently wooed at Lonely Crags from that day, and before the springtime came, he was engaged to Ruth Beckett. The summer passed pleasantly and quickly, for the autumn was to see the realization of their hopes. The bachelor uncle was extremely anxious to further the happiness of his niece in even the most trivial details, and on the same principle Mr. Barton, the elder, decided before the fixed day of happiness arrived that the active days of his life were past, and an arrangement was come to by which the newly wedded pair were to have and to occupy Heath Edge Farm. And so when the harvest was over and the leaves were turning brown, the bells of the old parish church rang out their merriest welcome, and the neighbouring woods and hills re-echoed and resounded with the bridal melody. Another happy home was established in our beautiful valley, and in less than 2 years' time the birth of a boy confirmed the happiness of the affectionate pair. The course of events, the love of her devoted husband, and the unceasing though light cares of her small household had almost driven from Mrs. Barton's mind all thoughts of Mr. Lee, and when any recollection of him occurred to her, she was too loyal to allow it to remain a moment in her breast. The marriage was 3 years past when one morning John Barton entered and told his wife that she and he were bidden to Lonely Crags to spend that evening, and by way of averting any possible refusal on Ruth's part, John added that a very old friend of her uncle was on a visit there. Need it be said that his friend was Mr. Lee, and that when she met his warm congratulations, Ruth felt that though she had never loved him, yet to her he was not as other men were. Her high sense of honour, and of what was due to herself and her husband, caused Ruth to withdraw as much as possible from Mr. Lee's company. During the succeeding fortnight they frequently met, chiefly at her uncle's house, for when John Barton insisted upon his wife's accompanying him thither, she hesitated to follow her own inclination, which was to refuse her presence while Mr. Lee remained. Why should she fear to accompany her husband? Mr. Lee had never spoken to her of love, not even in her maiden days, and now the news of her marriage was regarded by him as a matter for copious congratulation. On a sweet summer morning, Ruth opened the small lattice window of the little parlour to admit the scented air that came, with treasures of balm, from the incense-yielding meadows, where the moors were at work. Before the house was an orchard, within the quiet shadow of which the birds were unsilenced by the sun, but forever sang their hymn of praise. Ruth was absorbed in contemplation of this scene, until, startled by the voice of her uncle, who had entered unobserved, and who said in a breath that it was a very warm day, that the walk had made him sweat, and that he had just brought Mr. Lee to say good-bye before he went away again. Gabriel wanted to know where Jack was, and being told that he was in the hayfield, at once went to fetch him home. Mr. Lee and Ruth were left alone. He was sitting by the door. She was standing before the opened window. "I have put off saying good-bye to you all, until the very last moment, because this will probably be the last time I shall see you," said Mr. Lee. "I don't think I shall ever come again." In the innermost recesses of her heart, Mrs. Barton felt an uncontrollable sorrow at this news. With an attempt to stifle any external appearances of regret, she muttered a commonplace expression as to her uncle's sorrow at his going away. "He has not told you? He should perhaps have told you." "Nay, better not to load your heart with the news," said Mr. Lee with rising emotion. "But enough, I am going away, and never again shall I set eyes upon you, Ruth, my dearest Ruth." He had risen from his chair, and before she could discern his intention, he had taken her in his arms and printed a kiss upon her brow. Then, in an instant, he was gone. She felt a blush of anger and dismay as he set her down, and at that moment her bewildered eye caught sight of her husband, standing just outside the window. With a cry she fell fainting upon the floor, and unconscious of all that passed, she lay there until her husband and her uncle rushed into the room, when assistance was called for, and the senseless wife carried off to her own room. Ruth awoke in a high fever. The attendant informed her that her husband had told them to call him in when she became conscious, but she wildly refused to see him. She felt that no excuse would avail her in sight of her injured husband, and she dared not meet him. She almost wished that she might die before the time when she should be compelled to face his just anger. Day by day, as she lay weak and white, she pleaded one excuse and another in order to delay the inevitable hour of explanation, though she felt that every evasion served to strengthen the case against her. At last one morning her uncle, whom she had feared would never have come near her again, walked into the room, and said in his good old cheery way, "Now, Ruth, what's the matter with you, lass?" Ruth turned her inflamed eyes towards him, asked if there were any other persons in the room. Upon receiving his assurance that there were not, she told him the story, omitting no detail, and making of the whole an elaborate self-accusation that touched the old man deeply. "Why, Ruth, lass, I never thought it could be that. It was my fault that I have never told you the truth." It was Mrs. Barton's turn to look surprised now. "The news will do you more harm than good, but there's no help for that now," resumed Uncle Gabriel. "You remember the tale I told you about Mr. Lee's misfortune?" "I remember it well," said Ruth, gazing up at her uncle as he stood by her bedside. "And how he was once reported dead? I believed it to be really the case, but as you know, he returned, though compelled to travel about in secret and under a false name. Ruth, the man you call Mr. Lee is your father. This fact I was to keep secret from you, but under the circumstances I cannot. It is, then, the kiss of a father parting forever from his child that has brought all this trouble about." "And John, does he know?" "Knows, yes, knows well enough, and he's wondered how your father could be so cold to you, as he thought he was." And now Ruth knows well the difference between the affection of a child and the love of a wife.